So the blacksmith throughout the Middle Ages was the go-to guy for any sort of hardware. Blacksmiths made everything from pots and pans. They made armor and weapons. They made door hardware. They made railings. So everything metal was made by the blacksmith. As the centuries progressed, these blacksmiths started making machines, tools that could do things like lathes, and also they started experimenting more with cast iron as opposed to raw iron. Rock leads to hammer. That's what we do as a blacksmith. We do is hammer the steel to shape. Cast iron is when they heat it up to molten and pour it into shape. So in the 1700s, it became more feasible to do casting on a more factory-type scale. And by the 1800s, we had entered into the industrial age, where they started very specialized, large shops making the same unit again and again, and that's how we entered into our modern era. The industrial age allowed us to make things like steam locomotives and put train tracks all across the world and basically bring us right into the modern age. So by the time we get to the early 20th century, the blacksmith had suddenly taken the back seat. He was not the go-to guy for everything. It was much cheaper to buy things from factories that had been cast or made in under giant hammers. This is a tiny trip hammer here. In big steel yards and shipyards, they would have power hammers 100 times this size and would be able to make larger and larger pieces of steel. So the blacksmith with the hammer and the anvil became more and more of a specialized kind of antiquated thing. By the time we hit the 30s, we were in the Depression. Blacksmiths had been reduced to basically shoeing horses that were still around and doing repair work, that sort of thing. So the village blacksmith was more of a repair guy, do some horseshoeing, fix some things, but not the prestigious craftsperson that during the Middle Ages represented the pinnacle of the craftsman. All the other craftsmen had to come to the blacksmith to get their tools. He was the guy that made the tools for the woodworkers, the stone carvers, and everything like that. So they represented the top of the hierarchy of the craftsman's guild. So by the 30s, these guys, you just had a few guys in little towns, and they were basically just existing with their little repair shops. The Industrial Revolution had basically left them to the wayside. And during the Depression and then the Second World War, steel was very valuable and recycled. A lot of the anvils and a lot of tools that survived them through into the early 20th century melted down for recycling. So by the time we get through the Second World War, we're left with very few of the tools. We almost lost the link at that point, and a mere handful of blacksmiths scattered throughout the world. So the craft had almost died out to nothing. Then we get back into the 60s, back to the land movement, the hippies and homesteaders. Suddenly there was a renewed interest in arts and crafts, and it was at that time that people really started looking back and finding these old guys that were still existing and trying to get their knowledge before they were gone. And that's when the new wave of blacksmithing really started, was that back in the late 60s. The guy who taught me, Dean, would be in his 60s now. He started when he was in his 20s. He was a back-to-the-lander hippie out in Nova Scotia, and he got hooked up with another guy. They decided that this is what they wanted to do. So they were part of that kind of homesteader, resourceful grassroots movement, and they started doing blacksmithing on a very low scale, but got into it, and that's where the new genesis for the blacksmithing community, which we now see 30, 40 years later, has come from.